As you can see, by the way, we don't have my cool green screen app today because it started to malfunction. It was a freebie. That's probably why. Trying to encourage me to buy the costly app. So I had fun with that, but for now I have to throw it away and try to get these recordings done because it kept screwing up my recordings, and that is not cool. All right, so let's start with number one of our three categories. One of three, one of three, one of three. Hypersexual men. Hypersexual men, what's that all about? Well, these are men who have been defined by researchers as those who engage in online or in-person hypersexual behavior that is partner-oriented. And researchers who study sex addiction argue that this group is the largest in terms of sex addicts. The largest percentage of sex addicts belong to the group known as hypersexual men. Now, of course, keep in mind, this may or may not be accurate. It may be the case that there are also hypersexual women, but they don't come to the attention of researchers as easily or as frequently. And I want you to take a moment to think about why that might be. Think. It could be diagnostic bias. Even though technically there's no diagnosis, there are clinicians who diagnose it nonetheless. You know this from our last lecture. It may be the case that clinicians are more likely, they are more biased to call males who engage in certain types of behaviors as hypersexual and not women. It may be that women are less likely to even come to the attention of a clinician for these types of behaviors. Any number of possibilities, right? So we always have to question whether or not when we say there's more of a percentage of men than women in a particular diagnostic situation, is it an actual difference or is it a diagnostic bias? I want you to keep that in mind. Having said that, this so-called out-of-control sexual behavior, and remember from our prior lecture, hypersexual or out of control is being defined by those three different types of potential diagnostic criteria. The one that made it to the DSM and then was ultimately rejected is the one that I told you about last lecture. So keep those criteria in mind in terms of what researchers mean here by hypersexual. This out-of-control sexual behavior is not explained by bipolar mania or substance intoxication. So you may remember from our last lecture, I said that those who propose a category of hypersexuality to be diagnosed want to distinguish that behavior from individuals who only engage in promiscuous, out-of-control sexual behavior as part of a bipolar manic episode. Because one of the things we know about bipolar disorder, which is a mood disorder, is that in the manic phase, and those of you who have taken my mental illness class are well versed in bipolar disorder, in the manic phase, hypersexuality and promiscuous behavior is a common characteristic. So we want to distinguish hypersexual sex addictive behavior from bipolar conditions, where that behavior only occurs in a manic state as part of that illness. And we also want to distinguish it from situations in which people only engage in promiscuous or hypersexual behavior when they are intoxicated with a substance like alcohol, cocaine, etc. Having said that, a 2008 study, very interesting. I'm curious if you guys have ever heard of this. 2008 study focused on something referred to as slamming or slam sex. Slam sex. Slam sex. That's a good way to remember it. Slam sex. Who's heard of this? Anybody? Also known as chemsex. So chemsex is a trend that researchers have investigated, party and play, PNP, party and play, where people combine the risky behaviors of drug abuse and sex addiction into one experience. Studies indicate that this so-called chemsex has become more common, more prominent throughout the UK, so we're talking Britain here, the United Kingdom, and in the United States, with the evolution of apps like Grindr and other dating hookup apps like Tinder. Have you heard of Grindr? Have you heard of Tinder? The so-called draw or allure of these PNP, these party and play situations, is the use of drugs to create a state of sexual disinhibition where people purposefully take drugs to put them in a state of intoxication so they're less inhibited about being promiscuous. and can engage in sex with multiple partners over the course of, listen to this, multiple days. It's like a marathon drug and sex party. And the use of drugs as sexual disinhibitors is done purposefully so that people can endure nonstop marathon sex that goes on for days in a row and can engage in this promiscuous sexual behavior and stay engaged and be disinhibited and not sleep. So Grindr and other dating apps like Tinder have supposedly been avenues through which people pursue partners for these so-called P and pay. That's not, there's no paying here. There's no money involved here. P&P, party and play. And a recent study performed at St. George's University Hospital in May of 2018 showed the most commonly used drugs during so-called chemsex are GHB. And you may have heard of this before as the so-called date rape drug because date rape drug because it puts people in a state where they don't really know what's going on and they often black out and don't remember anything the next day that's taken place. Ketamine, which is actually originally something that was used as an anesthetic. Methamphetamine, which you can kind of think about as cocaine on cocaine. It's like cocaine amped up, ramped up. It's one of the most highly addictive drugs that a person could take. Cocaine is also involved in these parties and other forms of amphetamine, which are upper CNS, central nervous system stimulants that get people to stay awake for lengthy periods of time where they can continue. So basically, these drugs are used together, the GHB, the ketamine, the methamphetamine, the cocaine, and what they do is they create a state of both heightened central nervous system arousal where people can stay awake and keep going and going and going for days on end, but it also creates a state of altered consciousness where they don't really know what's going on and they might not even remember what they're doing, and these are being used for these so-called chem parties or chemsex parties. And this apparently is being done in the UK and in the US. These data, these research, these numbers were provided by nearly 300 men who at the time reported being actively involved in chemsex parties. 26% of the men in the study reported intravenous drug use. So they were actually injecting it into their veins. Men who were in the study also defined this type of drug use as what they call slamming. Slamming is a behavior that has been defined as men involved with sharing needles to inject themselves and multiple sex partners. And so it's really kind of been described as a drug-fueled orgy state where multiple people, many of whom are strangers, are using drugs together and injecting each other with these drugs so that they can stay involved in multiple sex parties for days at a time and have altered consciousness and not really know what's going on. The idea is to prevent themselves. It's really to prevent their higher brain centers, their cognition centers, their judgment centers. So who remembers what that is from prior classes? The prefrontal cortex, the frontal lobe. It's to prevent those regions from acting. It's to prevent those regions from stopping the impulse to continue to engage in these sexual behaviors over lengthy periods of time with lots of different people. Typically, these involve 5 to 10 men participating in unsafe sex and abusing substances together. These parties are also, as I said, known as slam sex and typically last a few days over the course of a weekend, as described by individuals who have been studied. Most of this research has been done, again, with men. Typical forms of sexual outlet for people who are described as hypersexual men, sex addicts, that type of sex addiction, is pornography use, compulsive masturbating, visiting strip clubs, and adult sex businesses, and repeatedly engaging in affairs with multiple partners, even if they are in a committed relationship and or married. Some researchers, like Levine and Semino, claim that there may be an underlying neurologic, so we're talking about the brain, or other physiologic factors involving the chemistry of the brain and body that could contribute to this behavior. And they're arguing that those same dopaminergic pathways that are disturbed, that are interrupted, that are hijacked, like we talked about, with substance and alcohol addiction may also be interrupted and hijacked for individuals known as hypersexual men suffering from this sex addiction problem that is highly controversial. Having said that, there has been a lack of research support for this idea, this dopaminergic pathway idea, except for a handful of studies conducted over a 3-year period between 2014 and 2016. We're going to hit that up on a later slide. I just gave you a lot of information to think about, so let it percolate, 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 and we are on to the next slide. See you soon.